Okay, so we are headed back to France. And we're basically going to go over the exact same time period we just went over. So our chronology, obviously we don't want to go chronological and jump from one context to another context. That makes no sense at all. But we're going back to France and we're going to say, okay, what's happening roughly at the same time period of the American Revolution all the way through the 19th century in France, which is still the center of the art world? And the answer is, just like we saw in England, a return to classicism. This is a work by Jacques-Louis David called The Oath of the Horatii, and it's your typical, what the French call neoclassical work, new classicism. Our context here is, remember the Rococo period? That's the last period we looked at in France. There was all those kind of frilly scenes of sexual titillation and so forth, the fête champêtre type stuff, the fête galante rather kind of stuff. Well, when Louis XVI comes to power, Louis looks around and he says, you know what, France is in massive moral decline, and this has led to the people questioning my power, thinking that maybe they'd want to get rid of a monarchy. What we need to do is we need to reestablish the importance of classical aesthetics in the French Royal Academy of the Arts. Remember that big institution. The French Royal Academy, which had been around since the time of Poussin, was still around here today. Very, very powerful force. It taught young painters the techniques of painting. It taught them the aesthetic philosophy. Remember Poussin's 4 rules. Got to start with a grand subject. Got to have a moralizing concept in there. Have to have that structure that we expect in classical works of art, meaning idealized, beautiful, all of those things. That's still in play. And he wants to bring it back. And he has a lot of support because remember what we said is also going on in the time and the context. Systematic archaeological explorations, excavations of Herculaneum and Pompeii, everyone going on the grand tour, right? Kind of a revival of classical ideas. So he pushes that, and he's got this young, darling artist that he can point to and say, wow, look at how great this guy is. He's like a modern-day Raphael, and that's this guy, Jacques-Louis David. So early in his career, remember again, this is very important to me, that these artists need to play the game of the French Royal Academy in order to get patrons, in order to get any kind of advertising, in a sense, to the public, for people to want to buy their works, for them to make a mark on history. They have to play this game. Early on in his career, Jacques-Louis David creates a couple of paintings, one of which wins him the coveted Prix de Rome. That Prix de Rome is that award you get as a young painter that gives you a 5-year all-expense-paid trip to Rome to continue your studies. Then he comes back and everyone wants to buy his works of art. This work here was initially commissioned by the Grand Assembly of France. The Grand Assembly is the parliamentary body that is most closely associated with monarchy at the time. France is a kind of monarchical parliamentary system, but not entirely, right? The monarchy is much more powerful than any of the parliamentary bodies that are supposed to be checking it. And the Grand Assembly is the closest aligned with the monarchy. They're basically the body that supports the aristocracy and the upper classes, where the Third Assembly, which we'll hear about in a minute, is the body that was supposed to support the middle classes and the lower classes. In any case, the government, in other words, commissions this work. The Oath of the Horatii subject is the only thing that I think you guys really need to know about. Everything else you can do because we've done this a million times now when it comes to classical aesthetics. The subject is ancient Rome. Remember what Poussin says, have to have a grand subject. It has to be a history painting, religious painting, something with a lot of gravitas, and here's one of them. At the very beginning of Rome, back with Romulus and Remus and so forth, remember Poussin's pushing that idea of the Sabine women and so forth. Here we get a little bit further along in the story, and the Romans are locked in endless battles with their neighbors, the Albans, and neither side can win. And it's a war of attrition. Both sides are losing tons of soldiers. Finally, both sides say, screw this. Let's just send our 3 greatest warriors into battle against one another. Winner take all. Whoever wins, that side wins. And they both agree to it. And here we have the 3 sons of Horus, the Horatii, pledging their allegiance to Horus, who is the leader of Rome at this time, and to Rome itself, right? Pointing to these swords and so forth, acting appropriately, sacrificing for the betterment of the government. See how this fits in perfectly with the context? Here's Louis XVI. We're headed up to the French Revolution, by the way. He knows, sees the writing on the wall. He and the Grand Assembly commission a work of art that says, sacrifice for the state, right? Give your own life up for the state. Then we look at this again, you're going to say, I hope, wow, this is totally a classical work of art. This could have been painted maybe even in the Renaissance. Because what do we have? We have idealized male bodies here. Perfect canons of proportions, right? What does that tell us about those soldiers? Besides they're beautiful, what else are they? They're good and they're true, right? They're in God's image. Of course they're going to win. And then we look at Horus. Why isn't Horus going to fight? I mean, he looks pretty buff too for being in his late 70s or something. But no, he's not the right man for the job. And a little indication, look at his posture. A little bit wobbly there, isn't he? He'd do it, but he's not the guy who can get the job done. What's our focal point in this work? The swords, right? All the implied lines pointing to them. Right in the center, it's at basically the vanishing point of the central one-point perspective. And what do you think that means? 3 swords gripped in an open palm together. Unity, right? We're all together in this, despite the danger. I mean, that's a sharp sword that he's gripping with his hand. How are the men acting? Remember how I said rationality, clarity, and order are all important in classical aesthetics? They're acting rationally. They're using their mind. They don't want to go die in this battle, but they know that's better than wars that will continue on and on and on and kill more and more people. So they're acting rationally. And they're sacrificing themselves for the betterment of the state. There's our moral message, our concept behind this. And then we get to something that the men are juxtaposed against, the women, over here. Now these women are lamenting the fate of their, well, 2 things. This is Sabina. Sabina is actually one of the Albans. She's betrothed to one of these sons of Horus. But she's also the sister of one of the Alban fighters who's going to go into battle. So she's either going to lose a brother or she's going to lose a potential husband, or maybe even both. And then Camilla over here is the opposite. She's a Roman, but she had been betrothed to one of the Albans. And again, she's going to lose someone. So they're acting emotionally. And what do we say that classicism thinks about emotions? At best, right? Temper them at best. You want to be rational. Emotions get in the way of a rational human being. So in other words, we put the women in here, and you've associated women with emotionality. That's an age-old stereotype, isn't it? Women are emotional, men are rational. I've seen plenty of the opposite be true in my life. And you do it not to say, hey, women couldn't possibly go fight, or women are bad. You do it basically to highlight the rationality of these men's act. And you can keep going on with this, right? Very, very composed picture, balanced picture, something that sets up a foreground and a middle ground. Now we don't have any deep background in Jacques-Louis David. He puts everything as if it's on a stage. Everything's set up in parts, right? 3 arches in the back way, 3 different groups of these figures. You know, typical classical works of art. Idealized bodies. Again, not idealized at all. Notice how upright, outward directed, idealized those figures are. That's what we're supposed to do. Look at how these all kind of collapse into themselves, are pushed back from the picture plane, are painted in these muted colors. That's to minimize these figures. Say emotionality is not what we want. So let me turn this one over to you. I think this is a Rococo word. Disabuse me of that idea, right? This is the Death of Socrates. Tell me how this fulfills Poussin's 3 or 4 major rules. How this work is very classical. Turn to your neighbors and share your thoughts. If you don't already know, the story is, of course, Socrates, who is the originary major Greek philosopher for Westerners at this time, the teacher of Plato and others, of course, was convicted of corrupting the youth of Athens, and he commits suicide. He's given this as an option by drinking hemlock, and that's what you're looking at here. Turn to your neighbors, explain to each other why this is a perfect classical work of art in detail. Okay, so let's do it this way. Poussin's first rule, right? If you want to be a great artist, if you want a great work of art, you have to start with a grand subject. Does this fit the bill? Yeah. We've got ancient Greek philosophers, the guy who basically taught Plato. Plato's at the root of all Neoplatonic thought. Neoplatonic thought's at the root of all of the aesthetic philosophy of classicism. Makes a lot of sense here, right? So then let's go on from there. Next thing, what's the moral message of this work? What's its concept? And one of the reasons I'm focusing on Poussin is the stumbling block on the midterms, as far as I can tell, was Et in Arcadia Ego. That was the one that a lot of you are like, what the hell? I didn't think this was going to be on there. So let's make sure we have this under our belt because, again, the French Royal Academy is key. So what's the concept here? What's he dying for? What was he doing to corrupt the youth of Athens? Anyone know?
Was he going up to him and questioning?
Yeah, he was asking them to question the world around them, to not accept authority blindly, to be critical thinkers, right? So he's dying for something that he believes in, that he thinks is right. He's one of those people where they went to him and said, recant, take it all back, change your life. And he's like, no, this is important. This is how humanity progresses. You need to be critical of that authority around you. You need to question things. You need to see if there's an alternative, something better, right? They said, well, that's no good. We just want people to have blind allegiance to authority. He wouldn't capitulate. So he's dying for his belief. Now we get to the part that hopefully is so familiar to you that you're like, I can just tick these off. Structure. How is this idealized? How is perfection, beauty, with a capital B, put into operation in this work? Give me one thing, just one. Yell it out. His body. Looking pretty darn fit for an old dude, isn't he? Yeah? Idealized body, in God's image, perfect, beautiful, true, good. They all go together. Hopefully you guys get that by this point, right? What else? Rationality. Rationality in terms of light, rationality in terms of act. This is the better way, but absolutely. What else? Clear focal point. Socrates, right in the middle. Everyone looking at him, pointing at him, right in the center, right? The figure that faces you, parallel to that picture plane. Absolutely. What else? What kind of spatial system will we put into play here? It's a linear one-point perspective, isn't it? So perfect ordering system, not the way that we perceive the world, but the way that they assume that there's some kind of mathematical order beneath all things. How about the rationality of this? Rational versus emotional. In this case, it's not women, it's men, his followers, that are acting emotionally while he acts rationally. Foreground, middle ground, no background in these works. But you see, again, hopefully this is very familiar to you by this point. Then something big changes in the world. Changes in Jacques-Louis David's career, too. The French Revolution. So in this class, we just have to do a brief on this. But basically what happens is that the parliamentary body and people who are supporting the lower and middle classes feel like they're going to be ousted from politics. No one's going to listen to them. There's already been a revolution brewing for a while. And they decide that they are going to organize this. And in 1789, they stormed the Bastille, which is a prison, but a prison that only holds political prisoners, and they free all the political prisoners. They start to negotiate with the crown. That doesn't go very well. The revolution swells even more, and pretty soon they are imprisoning the monarch, his queen, and then soon after that, they're executing a lot of people, including lots of aristocrats, monarchs, and so forth. So that period, then, is one which Jacques-Louis David, the painter, participated in. He was a part of the French Revolution. He was a member of a group run by Maximilien Robespierre, right? And his signature is actually on over 500 execution orders during the famous Reign of Terror, which if you've seen a period movie of this time, you know they're whacking heads off with guillotine for months at a time here, ousting all of their political adversaries, right? So this is the Jacobin party that he belongs to, Maximilien Robespierre, and the man that you see here is Jean-Paul Marat. Marat was, for lack of a better way to put it, the minister of propaganda for the French Revolution. He's basically kind of like the chief of staff. He's one of those figures that's a political operative, mainly behind the scenes, although not entirely, meaning everyone knows who he is. But he's pulling a lot of strings, and he's doing the kinds of things that in this messy situation probably need to be done. He's very good at it. But he's also someone who makes a ton of enemies at the time. I'm trying to think if there's anyone in I'm trying to think of like an example in contemporary politics, but our politics are so wackadoodle right now that I can't even think of anyone to point to. But back when if you remember when you guys are probably kids in the Bush administration, there was a guy by the name of Karl Rove, who was this guy. He was really good at all these things. And if you're on the side of the French Revolution, the Jacobin Party, you loved him. And if you were anyone else, you hated him. So it happens with Marat. You're seeing him here in his death, right after his death. He has been stabbed to death while he was administering to French affairs, soaking in a bathtub because he had a skin disease that he needed to take medicinal baths, and this was kind of common for him. And it happens to be the place that he was assassinated. What happens is that a woman by the name of Charlotte Corday actually snuck into his chambers and stabbed him in support of an alternative movement. Again, by this time, Marat is just getting rid of anyone who's a political adversary. But the way that Jacques-Louis David tells this story is different than the historical reality. And it has a heck of a lot to do with these letters. These are readable, by the way, in the real work. This is the letter that supposedly Charlotte Corday wrote him to gain admittance. And truth be told, she did write him a letter. He just ignored it. But later on, Jacques-Louis David revives this letter, puts it in the dead man's hand as if this woman had gained entry by subterfuge. What the letter says is, my name is Charlotte Corday. It's only my great misery that gives me a right to ask you to be beneficent towards me. I have lost, and then you can't quite tell what she said. But you can tell that he's been generous before, because this other letter, which is also readable, had come from someone else that said, I've lost my 5 sons in the revolution. Can you help me out? And he is penning a letter back, or getting ready to pen a letter back. And on top of that, and this is key, there is the French paper money of the revolution. That money is what's known as an assignat. Write this down. A-S-S-I-G-N-A-T. It's like us saying dollar. That's all it means, an assignat. And the assignat was a new form of paper money minted for the French Revolution during a time period, this is probably going to sound pretty parochial to you, but during a time period in which money actually had to be secured against some other real value. You couldn't just print out money and say, okay, it's got value. What they used to do, of course, after coinage, where the money actually had the value of whatever it was made out of, when they started creating basically representative currency, you would keep a bunch of gold somewhere, and you print only as much money as you had gold. Then that kept kind of changing, and you could use other forms of property. At this point, the reason I'm going into this story is that this money's value was secured by all of the properties that had been expropriated from the royalty, the aristocracy, and the French Catholic Church. In other words, they took all of these properties, all of this money, French Revolution did, stuck them in supposedly a vault, and then they printed out these assignats. These assignats had value based upon that stuff that they had taken away from, again, the higher-ups. In other words, when he is giving out this money here, what you're looking at is maybe the earliest documentation of the idea of, redistributing wealth from the aristocracy, from the monarchy to the lower classes. And the French Revolution's doing that. So it's propaganda for the French Revolution, right? He's a good guy. She's a bad person. She's the one who lied to him, played upon his mercies, and then stabbed him to death, which isn't exactly what she did. And then you've got a bunch of other things. A lot of people were worried that all that property that had been expropriated was filling the pockets of the revolutionaries. But look at where he is administering to affairs. His table is basically a board over the top of a bathtub with a blanket on top, and his end table is a crate set up on its side. Right? There's no Louis XIV chair here. This is all really, really meager, furniture here. What else do you notice here about the way that Marat is represented? Who does he look like? I've seen enough of these now. Who does he remind you of, I should say? Does he look a little bit like Jesus in a deposition scene? Remember the death of General Wolfe, associating Wolfe with Jesus? Here we do it again, right? An allusion to Jesus. He's a martyr for his cause being the French Revolution. He's stabbed not quite in the side, but pretty close, arm languidly leaning over a white cloth, very standard representation of Jesus in these deposition or taking him down off the cross scenes, right? And then you see this, a little bit of symbolism. His quill next to the knife that killed him. His ideas, or frankly, the pen, is mightier than the sword. The final thing that you can't quite tell here is that the lighting is anything but rational. This is not, in any kind of traditional sense, of classical work at all. In fact, the only thing that seems classical about this is it's an important subject, and he's idealized his body a little bit. All those skin, ailments have gone away, but besides that, everything's gone. The light that hits this letter, which you can't see very well here, is yellow and raking light. It looks like it's hitting every imperfection in the paper. It feels wrong. It just looks too glaring. versus the soft light that bathes him, right? It's meant to say bad, good, just by changing the way the figures are lit. So Jacques-Louis David is attached to the French Revolution, but then we know what happens with the French Revolution. It collapses under its own weight. It goes kind of crazy. The Reign of Terror gets a lot of people into a lot of trouble. France is in turmoil at the end of the century when this young, very charismatic, very bright military commander, Napoleon Bonaparte, takes power. Now, he doesn't officially take power until the early 1800s, but France is in such turmoil that he basically functions as the leader of France from 1799 when he returns from his African campaigns and until he starts going on his huge military conquests of Western Europe in the early 1800s. And Jacques-Louis David, who went to prison after the French Revolution, by the way, gets out of prison and offers his services to Napoleon as basically a painter for the emperor. So what do you do if you're a painter for a major military leader, a totalitarian leader? You try to make him look good. Remember Diego Velázquez? That's all you do. And here you have a picture called Napoleon crossing the Saint Bernard. Saint Bernard is a pass in the Alps. He's on his way to go conquer, of course, Western Europe. And you see him riding this charger, rearing back, and you see his name on this rock. This slide or image has been cropped here. There's actually two more names there. Hannibal's name's there and Charlemagne's name's there. Earlier conquerors, earlier emperors from earlier times. Napoleon saying, I am like them. In the background, you see the cannons. He was particularly good at using artillery in his campaigns, and so those have been highlighted here. But of course, it's all just a big historical fiction. I mean, it looks good. It's a great picture, right? Beautiful, beautiful horse. Remember the metaphor here. The leader leads his horse the way he leads his army and leads his people. So when you see someone on a rearing charger and they look completely nonchalant about it and they're in control of things, that's meant to say even in the most difficult times, Napoleon can control his people, control his army. It goes back to ancient Roman equestrian monuments. But of course, that's not how he went across the Alps. This would be the stupidest way possible to go across the Alps on a horse like that. Anyone know what the historical reality is? He went on a donkey. It's a no-brainer, right? Much more sure-footed beast. Not as good a picture, though, is it? Oh, I'm skipping that one. Sorry. So then, some of you will know this story as well. This is the interior, by the way, of Notre Dame Cathedral, where Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned emperor, or crowned himself emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, as he called it. And you're witnessing a work that is called the crowning of Josephine, the crowning of the empress, also called Le Sacre. It's a huge work. It's at least that big, probably a little bit bigger than that. In which you get to see this scene. And he's put everyone who was in attendance for this coronation as portraits all over the place. He had a huge workshop, Jacques-Louis David did. He puts Napoleon here, crowning his empress, the Pope of the time over here, and so forth. He even puts himself up here in the loge next to Napoleon's mother, witnessing this whole scene. Once again, it's a form of kind of political propaganda. It's all about the regalia of a massive coronation. It does show you the people who are there, but you know that there was a major controversy that's still not solved. I mean, a lot of people believe that Napoleon kind of fudged when he told the story about what actually happened here, and others think it's completely true, that when the Pope went to crown him, he said, "You're not going to crown me. There's no one more important on earth than me. I'll crown myself." Other people believe that he didn't really say that, but he certainly did take the Pope's job when it came to crowning his own empress. And we certainly see that happening. The Pope is supposed to be doing this. We also see some things that got changed somewhere along the way. For instance, Napoleon's mom didn't go. I don't know why she didn't go. Maybe she's like, nah, you're going to fail, son, anyway. I don't know what she was thinking. She didn't go, but Napoleon said, paint her in anyway. Just stick her in there. It's like early Photoshop. Or this guy here, the Pope, He wasn't happy about this. It's his job to be the guy who crowns everyone. He was pretty mad about the whole thing. Originally, that hand is actually in his lap. We know this from studies of underpainting. You can do X-radiography and see what this was painted like in the first place. And then somewhere along the line, someone was like, no, make him do a kind of blessing, right? Like he's on his way to blessing this whole affair. So let's move on to another artist. As Jacques-Louis David's getting older, and by the way, his career ends in shame after Napoleon crashes and burns. It's like, dude, you've burned every bridge possible, right? You're first attached to the monarchy, then your French Revolution, then the emperor. Get the hell out of here, and they send him off to Belgium for the end of his career. But as he is getting a little bit older, the young, very, very promising painter and a guy who is incredibly gifted is Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. It looks like Ingers or something. It's pronounced Ingres. And he comes along and, hooks himself up to Napoleon too. So my question to you is, you're looking at Napoleon on the Imperial throne by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. It's a really simple one. How is this work pushing the idea of the authority of Napoleon? What are all the different ways that a painting such as this does that? Say, I am important. So you've got symbolism, you've got various formal elements, you've got various illusions and so forth. Let's see how far you can go with this. Turn to your neighbors and share your thoughts. So someone give me one thing that you've noticed that are like authority. This guy's powerful, important. What's doing it? One thing. He's big. Is that what you said? He's bigger than you think he is, too. Is that the story? But everyone heard that Napoleon's like this tall. He's like Tyrion, right? No, he's actually average size. I don't know where that rumor ever got started. He's an average sized guy, but he makes him look big. How? He fills up the frame, right? You can't establish scale except in relation to the frame. So if you see someone up to the top of the frame, out to the sides of the frame, filling up that frame, it's going to make them look bigger. It's like you can make someone feel like that's a big person with a tiny little photograph if you stick them right up there close. What else? That's it. That's all you got? You're not helping me, are you? Clothes. What kind of clothes are you wearing? Lots and lots of velvets and gold and things that look like he's incredibly rich and has a quite flamboyant seamster or something like that. Things, by the way, that are associated with ancient Roman emperors as well. So the laurel crown on his head made out of gold, that's the old crown of the Caesars, right? And originally the senators. And then you've got this chain around his neck. That's also associated with ancient Romans. You've got the eagle in the foreground, ancient Romans as well, and Zeus, by the way. These are all symbols of ancient powers that he's saying, I am the next, emperor in the line of the great Roman emperors of the past. What else? I mean, it's almost so obvious that you don't even say it, but this is almost pan-cultural. People sitting in big, cool chairs, what we call thrones in the West, Pretty good indicator this is an important person. How about what he's holding? What's that? I mean, these are just generally when there's some kind of fancy rod that are supposed to symbolize power. They're called scepters. In this case, what's one that has that symbol? Where have you seen that before? That's Jesus' blessing, right? So religion. I've got dominion over all things religious. This one, by the way, has a little orb at the top. I've got dominion over all things earthly as well. I'm all-powerful. The final thing is, of course, the way that this is posed. It's full frontal looking right at you. And this was a type of format of posing that you didn't use in portraits, very rarely even used in representations of great leaders. You use it more often than not in representations of God or gods, such as this work. And we talked about this on one of the first days, right? You want to make someone really uncomfortable, face off to them, right? Look them directly in the eye. Don't do this and look at them. Look at them right like this and see if they don't kind of shuffle the other way. That's something that got adopted to be used in representations of gods, in particular Jesus in Byzantine icons looking right back out at you. It's a way of establishing authority. It's preserved more often than not, though, for representations of God, and this is a representation of Jupiter, or as the Greeks call him, Zeus, and Thetis. It's another work by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang. And the story, again, ancient Greek story about the mother of Achilles, Thetis. Thetis is a lesser goddess. Of course, Achilles is the most important warrior in the Trojan War story. He's half mortal, half god. He was made impervious by his mother in all areas except for his ankle when she dipped him into the river Styx, and the only reason his ankle was unprotected is she was holding him by that ankle when she dipped him in there. Achilles is, if you've read the Iliad, of course, you know he's the most powerful warrior in that whole story. When things are going well for him, things go well for the Greeks. When things are going poorly for him, things go poorly for the Greeks. At this moment, what's going on is that Achilles is basically brooding in his tent. He's pissed off that someone else claimed a concubine, Bracius, that he thought should be his. So he's like, forget it, man, then I'm not going to fight. And everything starts going poorly for the Greeks. So what Thetis is doing is she's going to try to talk Zeus into talking to Achilles to get him back into the war. Now my question for you is, how is this work incredibly gendered? Share your thoughts with your neighbors next to you. So what do you think? How does this partake of standard stereotypes about the genders? Yeah.
Thetis is super emotional.
Okay, he looks like he can't be disturbed by anything. He's just, whatever, stoic, staring off into space. She's pretty sad about the whole thing. So we've got rational, emotional, certainly. How does that extend to those bodies again? I mean, what's Zeus's body look like? Standard, idealized, very, very powerful. I mean, I wouldn't mess with him. Does he look like someone not to be messed with? He makes her look tiny. And then we get to her, and I'm sorry, I'm unclear if there's any bones in that body. I mean, it looks like putting in a sock or something. I mean, it's just like, what is that? Let's go beyond that, though. How does Zeus get things done? Let's say Zeus has to get something done. How is he going to get it done? I think he just goes kicks some ass, right? He just exerts his own power. Big, strong body, looks like he could go basically threaten anyone into getting anything he wants done. How does Thetis get Zeus to do something? She's like, Zeus, do it or I'll pop you one in the face, man. No. She's just going to seduce him. Right? She'll just seduce him. Tickle, tickle, tickle on the, I mean, it's wackadoodle. On the, oop, let me just rub your chinny chin chin. Lean into your lap. My point here is really simple. What's woman's power? Over and over again. What's the idea of where women's power comes from? It's very closely connected to that idea of women appearing. That if you put the highest priority of women on either their being a mother or their appearance, always their power has to be exerted indirectly through a man. She doesn't go and talk Achilles into doing something with a rational argument. What she does is she says, I know, I'll get Zeus. And by the way, yeah, it's Zeus, so she probably knows his soft spot here. But it's always through using her sexuality, which then gets proffered to the public as if women's sexuality is a real power that can be exerted in this way. And you see it all the time, even in your world today, right? How do women exert power? They seduce men. And then you think about this a little bit. Is that really a power? Is that a power that anyone feels comfortable, let's say, exerting? Is it a power that's respected by anyone in the world? No. It's a really circumscribed power, and yet it's put out there in front of you all the time. So a huge part of Eng's work were these Greek myths, and when you can get those, again, because they're classical subjects, right, they're interesting, they've got their moral message to them. If you can fit these Greek stories into what's going on at the time, too, it makes them even better. And one of the things I haven't talked to you about yet is that before Napoleon really took power, he went on what were known as the African campaigns, where he took a huge naval fleet with a big army aboard and 200 scholars, by the way, to go take over parts of Egypt to secure various trade routes for the French from the British. Of course, the French and the British are constantly in competition at this time. And what happens is you have this renewed interest in Egypt, right? The first renewed interest in Egypt, because these scholars are accompanied by artists who are drawing pictures. If you're wondering why all that Egyptian stuff is in the Louvre, it's because they stole it at this time and brought it back to France. It's also the time, by the way, that they discover the Rosetta Stone. Now, they haven't figured out how to translate hieroglyphics yet, but that's coming along the way. In other words, you have this renewed, as I was talking about with classicism, interest in Egypt and Egyptology, and even more extensively, interest in what was called the Orient. Now, the Orient's a weird term, and there's a reason we don't use Oriental anymore. The Orient could be anywhere from North Africa to the Far East. In fact, the best scholar I ever heard talk about this said, just think of the term. It's the way that Western Europe oriented itself vis-a-vis its cultural others. That's all it meant. It could be anything. It's a mystical other realm of weird fantasies. So when you see this one, Oedipus and the Sphinx, on the one hand, of course, it's all about the Greek myth of Oedipus. And on the other hand, the Sphinx, that's right. Pictures of the Sphinx, paintings of the Sphinx, those were all coming through Western Europe at the time. So the story, some of you know, Oedipus he's got a rough life, doesn't he? Oedipus' story is that when he's a little kid, and we've talked about this, right? No one's going to take your kids to see a Greek oracle, are you? Bad idea. It never works well. In this case, takes him to see the Greek oracle, and the Greek oracle says, no, he's going to grow up to be a great leader. He's going to be amazing. He's going to be brilliant. Everything's going to go well, except Dad, he's going to kill you, and Mom, you don't even want to know what's going to go on with you, right? So just be aware. And so they're like, get rid of him. Later in the story, he's wandering around. He's on his way to Thebes. He hears this story. Again, don't use this. If you've got an English literature test, never use my summaries of any of these stories. They're not complete. He's on his way to Thebes to help Thebes get out from under the thrall or the bad will of this Sphinx, who has taken up residence on the outskirts of Thebes and basically is challenging all men to contests of intellect called riddles. And if you win, she'll die or something, or go away. And if you lose, she gets to kill you. Now, Sphinx, of course, are chimeric figures. They're half women, half lion, half eagle, all put together in a composite. They're always supposed to be, in Western cultures, somehow monstrous. In other cultures, of course, they're very powerful creatures. And here, in this riddle that he is trying to solve, all about his rational mind, which is, again, reflected in that very perfect, idealized body, the riddle goes, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening? And the answer is man, who crawls in the morning of his life, walks upright, and then uses a cane at the end of his life. And, of course, Oedipus will get this correct and get rid of the Sphinx and go on to other things. But the key part about this is, again, the new exoticism of the so-called Orient, things coming, in this case, from Egypt, the rational powers of mankind. I'm assuming Oedipus isn't running around nude all over the place, so it's clearly a classical work of art that's saying perfect body, therefore perfect intellect, staring down the evil Sphinx and beating it. So I just want you to think about this for today, and when we come back on Wednesday, we'll go into this work. This is probably Eng's most famous work. It's a work called the Grand Odelisk. And it's no longer entirely classical. It's not quite into the Romantic movement yet. But it's the long tradition of the female nude taking its next iteration. Remember, we didn't even start here, but originally the female nude, those are Greek goddesses. They oftentimes have their own temples. They're seen as effigies of the goddesses in a culture that doesn't have a lot of worry about sexuality. Then they show up in the Italian Renaissance as emblems of beauty in works like Botticelli that we didn't look at because they start before this class. Then all of a sudden they're laying down, giving you come hither looks, and supposedly they're still Venuses and still all about beauty, but I think you've heard me say this enough that it's like, be a little suspicious of that. Whoa, hold on for a minute. And then by this moment in time, we're no longer just laying in a bed giving you a come hither look. And Odelisk is literally a harem slave. She's a sex slave and you're the presumptive owner. And yet still in this culture that's moderately allergic to sexuality, that's certainly a little bit questionable about something that could be understood as erotica in the realm of high art, is picturing sex slaves lying in bed, giving you come hither looks, and exhibiting these in the French royal salon and saying, no. It's all really just still about beauty with a capital B. All right, we'll see you on Wednesday. But I want to take you through kind of the timeline of the female nude, and hopefully you'll have these ideas under your belt. None of this will sound unfamiliar. And I'm not going to go slow, right? I'm going to presume that you have this knowledge. If we had started this class in the middle of the Renaissance, we would have seen people like Sandro Botticelli revitalizing the old tradition of the female nude that existed way back in Greek times, when those goddesses were represented in sculptural form as oftentimes effigies of the goddess. They existed in their own temples. They were things that were worshipped. They were things that were sacrificed to. They were meant to be stand-ins for the gods in that culture as well, which is quite different than Western culture of the Renaissance that's highly Christian. You could have a goddess like Aphrodite, later known as Venus, who was a messy, messy goddess by, contemporary Judeo-Christian standards. Her power was her sexuality. If she wanted to get something done, she just seduced people And no one thought, oh my God, that's unfair, or ooh, she's sinful, or whatever. This was her power. And so in representing her, you don't have all of the weirdness around representing sexuality that you do when you get to Judeo-Christian culture. When Sandro Botticelli revitalizes that, if you know his work, you'll know that there's very little about his work that appears to be sensual or erotic. It really does fit the bill of a work of art that's about, it's not those canon of proportions of a Michelangelo or something, but all these beautiful arabesquing lines, all of these perfect geometrical forms, all of this elegance in that body is supposed to be about beauty. He was caught up in the ideas of Neoplatonism, and he wanted to represent that in the female form, and he does it in a way, at least by relative standards, that I don't find erotic. I don't look at it and say, wow, she's really hot. I just look at it and say, wow, that's so beautiful, right? And it happens to be a nude woman. So, in my mind, really good example of Neoplatonic ideas applied to the female nude in something like Botticelli. Now, we didn't start with him, so many of you are like, I don't know what you're talking about. So let's jump forward a little bit and we get to Titian. And now all of a sudden, we've already justified the female nude on two grounds. We've allowed this to exist in a culture that in any other place in culture, they wouldn't allow nudity. They wouldn't say this is appropriate. But we've allowed it to be okay because the Greeks and Romans did it, and because we have this new idea of Neoplatonism that says beauty is a manifestation of the divine. They're very, very good arguments or ways of framing the nude, and so it becomes acceptable. Titian, though, pushes it one step further, doesn't he? He takes that nude, he lies her down on a bed, he has her give you a come hither look. There's all these indications that, this is all about her body. Right? You've got the hand gesture, the axis of that curtain in the background, the roses in her hand, the tied-up hair that still spills forth, the myrtle plant in the background, the cassoni that refer to marriage pictures. There's tons of eroticism in there, tons of indication of sexuality, and yet it's still acceptable on the grounds that, hey, it's a Venus figure. Now remember what I said about that. They didn't start calling it Venus in their letters until after the work was produced. When the Duke of Urbino is asking for his painting, he's saying, when are you going to give me the nude? When are you going to give me the nude? Even titling it Venus justifies it. That's okay. It's Venus, right? Venus is okay. Remember I made that example of, if I were to take a picture of someone and hang it on the wall and they're nude, giving me that come hither look, I'm fired. But if I just reproduce 1 million Titian Venus of Urbinos and plaster them all over the place, people will allow me to get away with it because it's art. So it's trying to get you to tease through these things that make you think about or frame certain things in particular ways. The other part was, well, maybe it is erotic, but it's an eroticism that's been sublimated. Remember that term? Sublimated means you take something that is base and vulgar or lowbrow, like just sexual desire, and you say, wait, we're rechanneling this into the creation of great, beautiful art. And that justifies it as well. That goes on and on and on and on, and you'll be happy to know I didn't bore you with every single nude that I could have shown you because there's millions of them out there, but it comes back in force in the 19th century with the return of Neoclassicism in France and to a lesser extent in England. And then it gets a bolster when Orientalism, which is starts as a branch of Romantic literature, starts showing up in the visual arts, which is what we're looking at here in Ingres' The Grand Odelisk, which simply means the large Odelisk. And an Odelisk, just so you know, is a harem slave. So this is a sex slave now. And stories about what was going on in the Orient, which remember, it's not a real place, right? It's anything else other than Western Europe. It can be anywhere from North Africa all the way to the Far East. It's just somewhere else, this mythical other place. Stories are coming back from these areas, partially from the Grand Tour, and in France in particular, especially after Napoleon's African campaign. Soldiers are coming back and saying, you'll never believe what I saw. And by the way, none of them saw it, they just heard about it, because these are very private areas. But it's a total male fantasy. The stories they would tell are beautiful women all just waiting around, wearing beautiful clothing or nothing at all to have sex with these rich, again, Oriental people. That gets going and going and going, gets romanticized, and then it starts showing up in visual arts. At this point, though, you need another, in a way, framing device, something to make this okay. You already have the idea that on one level the nude is okay because it goes back to Greece and Rome. It's been redone by the Renaissance. It's all about beauty. Then you add to that something like, okay, well, she's lying in a bed, and it's about sex, after all. She is a sex slave. Maybe it's sublimation. Let's add that in there, too, and see if that one flies. And if that doesn't work, a big one at this time was a kind of another double articulation that starts with this premise. This is happening somewhere else. We in France don't treat our women this way. We would never, ever own them as sexual slaves. Never mind that France won't give anyone the right to vote until after World War II or anything, but never mind, right? They don't have the right to own property. They don't have the right to divorce their husbands, but we would never treat women this way. And therefore, the way this whole unfolding of the viewing dynamic starts is by saying, we're not like them, those others that do these horrible things to their women. It starts with a kind of cultural superiority or little criticism of people who do. But as I always say with a double articulation, it says that so as to justify you taking pleasure in the very thing that it's supposedly criticizing. After all, these things don't get popular because people want to be like, oh, those Orientals are so bad, right? It's the same thing that we saw with the Greek slave by Hiram Power. It's a way to justify showing something that otherwise it would have been unacceptable in society. So that's your starting point for that. And then we look at this picture, and again, remember, Eng is a neoclassicist, but there are parts of this that are totally not neoclassical. They have to be fit into this context of the Oriental style. And the big one is, if you look at her body, right, and they've always messed around with the female body. It's never really been a great canon of proportions. You'll notice that that beautiful, long, arcing back does not make any sense in a real world. Like if she stands up, can you imagine what her proportionality would be? And critics who were aligned with classicism pointed this out. They said, wow, the proportionality of this is wacky. She has at least 3 too many vertebrae, is what one of them said. But you almost forgive that because it's this beautiful line, right? And the body itself has this beautiful long back, and then it has something that was very hot at the time, a kind of wider hip, a little kind of almost peekaboo of the bottom. You've got this play off the idea of negative space here with a negative space here and a peekaboo of a breast, and then the positive space of a knee, 3 triangles in a row. I mean, he's basically trying to create a beautiful form out of that body. He does emphasize the erogenous zones, but he's also playing with this idea of formal beauty, just a beauty of line and shape and form, whether or not it corresponds to a real body or not. Now, in addition to that, let's just talk about the scene that is set up here. Who are you presumed to be as the viewer in this viewing dynamic? She's a harem slave. Who are you?
The owner.
You're the owner. She's yours. She's there for you. We couldn't get any more literal about active-passive, could we? You own her. She is your object literally in this viewing dynamic. There's no question about it. She is there for you. She's the nude, like par excellence, right? No nakedness, no feelings, no desires of her own in there at all. And if that weren't enough, notice how she's set up right next to an opium pipe there, which was seen as an aphrodisiac and also something that makes her even more compliant. Right? The whole thing is set up so as to provoke your desire as the presumed heterosexual male, while authorizing it or saying it's okay to feel this way because, of course, we don't treat our women this way anyway. Now, with all that being said, can you tell how this is trending towards the kind of trajectory of sensualism rather than rationalism. Everything in this is touchy-feely. You got the skin, you've got the satins and the silks, you've got furs, you've got feathers, right? Everything is about your senses. You've got the sense of smell. This is an incense burner over here. Originally, in this little area here, he had a little waterfall element to get in sound, as in the tinkling of water over here. It's supposed to be touchy-feely. It's supposed to evoke your senses. It's the one place that they are allowed to take some basic classical ideas like the female nude and push them into the realm of the sensual, because it's the Orientalist style. Now, with all of this being said and all these things that I want you to know about these conceptually, if you ever get to see this work in person, you'll know that it is a beautiful little jewel box. It has the most gorgeous colors you've ever seen in your life. The skin is flawless. All of the textures, you can feel them with your eyes. It's in the Louvre in its own space, and it's just like breathtakingly beautiful. And that's one of the reasons that even if you're aware of a lot of these problems, like that these teach us to objectify women as men. These teach women to want to fit into this role of being desirable above all else. That's, in a way, that's the kind of conceptualization of this. The other thing that goes along with these things is that they're gorgeous, they're beautiful, they're very appealing. And that sometimes makes us forget some of the other things that are problematic about them. And again, it's not an either-or thing here. You don't have to hate everything about this work because maybe it disagrees with your idea of how people should treat women. But on the other hand, you don't want to forget that there's a whole host of things that are quite problematic about this work as well. So you do this one for me. Help me out. This one's called The Turkish Bath. Now it's a much later work, but it's by the same artist, Chonagos Dominique Ang. And in this case, we've got a harem scene. So how would you make sense of this, criticize, analyze this according to everything you've learned about the tradition of the female nude? Turn to your neighbors and share your thoughts about this. All right, someone help me out. What's one thing you notice about this that, maybe before this class you wouldn't have pointed out, and now you're like, oh, yeah, I know what this is about. Uh-oh. I was looking for a little bit of good feedback. Yeah.
It's not a realistic theme.
What? Serious? This is what women do when we're not around? I mean, exactly. Let's talk about all the ways this isn't realistic. I don't know what's a part of your world, but when I was in high school, kind of like once a year, they would have one of those throwaway movies that would come out. It was clearly for young men. And it'd always have that scene where someone had like drilled a hole through the boys' locker room into the girls' locker room. You could look through, and when you looked through, it was like beautiful women prancing around without their clothes on, swatting each other with their towels and flipping their wet hair around. And, you know, every man's like, what? Really? That's what happens? You know, of course, it's all male fantasy. But what specifically about this is not realistic? Yeah?
Well, it's supposed to be about a bunch of sex slaves, and realistically, they probably are not love and life. They kind of
Okay.
portrayed.
Yeah, let's start there. You've got a room full of harem slaves. How many people think that what they do all day, and again, Westerners aren't getting in to view these areas, they're totally private, so they're just making up their own fantasies. But how many people think they're probably not just sitting around all day without their clothes on, hanging out, doing things like, hey, let's play some music, I want to dance, braid my hair, oh, I'm cold, cuddle with me. I mean, it's just ridiculous, right? So we've got this thing set up to make it seem like their life is happy-go-lucky and there's nothing bad about it, and you know, they're just all waiting around to have sex with people, and there's no real downside to it, I guess. Like, it looks like a big party. What else? Yep. They are super intensely contorted, and for what reason? You know? To show off, to emphasize things that are understood at this time to be erotic. And so it's a little bit like if you think about some of the poses that you'll see in, let's see what's out now, the ESPN swimsuit model whatever thing, Sports Illustrated thing, right? Look at the poses that those women take, and it's like, that can't be comfortable at all. But they look fantastic, right? You're like, wow, that really makes your body look great, but ouch, you know? And that's exactly what's going on here, and has been going on, as I said, all the way back with Titian's work. It just gets more obvious here. What else? Did anyone kind of note this thing too, either here or here, that if this is supposedly taking place in the mystical Orient, what's wrong with this picture?
They're almost all white.
They look really white, right? I don't know where we're supposed to be, but these look like very white Western European women at best. And the way you can tell that is it's like, okay, wait, someone looks like they might actually be from somewhere other than Europe. Right? So it doesn't even make sense, that starting point, hey, we don't treat our women this way, but we're going to fantasize about women from somewhere else looking like what we find attractive in Europe. What else? Yeah?
There's a over-the-top voyeurism here, because the positioning of the first character, the woman with the instrument, is such that grabs the attention, but you cannot see her, you cannot recognize her.
Good. So we got a lot of voyeurism going on here, and it starts before the fact that she's turned away and not looking towards you. No one can acknowledge you're there because, does anyone notice what the frame is? That is the shape of the frame. It's as if you're looking through a peephole and witnessing a scene of harem women. So it literalizes the idea of you as the voyeur. And remember why this is so important. If you're a voyeur, no one looks back at you and says, dude, you're nowhere near our level, right? No one looks back at you and says, you're a creep. No one acknowledges your existence. You're in a position of authority, a position of power. It is, whether or not the scene on the other side is sexual, being in a voyeuristic position is an authoritative position. You don't get judged in return. You're the judger. And you can keep going on with this kind of forever, but I think you guys get the point, right? Yeah?
I have a question about the string instrument.
Yeah.
Because you said that the string instrument is like a way of sublimating, like making vulgar things to art. But if it's like supposed to be a mystical orientalizing scene, does it still like
Good. So her question is, we've got a stringed instrument. Stringed instruments are associated on the one hand with eroticism. We saw it way back there with the Titian Giorgione work, Fête Champêtre, remember that? And we've got the blown instrument, the stringed instrument. But remember, stringed instruments more closely associated with the sublimation of desire. And isn't that what this is all about? I mean, isn't that what he's trying to say? I'm taking a subject that's totally erotic, a harem scene, and I am turning it into fantastic high art. So good catch. Right? And you just have to go on and on and on with this for a minute. One of the things that Linda Nochlin points out, and I usually bring this back later on too, is that what happens if you imagine this from the standpoint of inverting it? And what I'm asking you to do is, this becomes so naturalized that a lot of us just look at it and say, whatever, I've kind of seen something like this before, it's not that big of a deal. But I want you to do just a little thought experiment for me, just for a second here. I'd like all the women in the class to imagine if we shifted this around and you had a scene that is a male equivalent of this. Can you imagine wanting to desire to look through a peephole and see an entire bevy of dudes hanging out like this? How many women are like, yay? I mean, if for no other reason than like comic purposes. That would be funny, right? I mean, just think of it for a while. How does that denaturalize the whole thing to imagine an inversion of this? How would it work? It would get kind of weird, wouldn't it? And a bunch of feminist artists, by the way, of the 1960s and 70s started doing that just to show you how naturalized this type of image or fantasy has become. I mean, one of the things that when you look at those images, a lot of women point out right off the bat is you see this scene, and I doubt there was a single guy in this class that looking at this said, oh, no, there's too many of them in there. Right? Most guys are like, I didn't even think of that, right? Women immediately, in some of the feminist scenes where you've got an entire slew of naked dudes in there, they're like, whoa, don't want to walk in there, it looks dangerous. I don't want that many guys in my space, right? Especially hanging out the way they're hanging out. Men don't operate the same way because they don't actually think in the same way. This isn't about their desire. One of the things that I hear women talk about all the time when they see those feminist works is, I don't want to go in there. It's like, how there's too many guys, and what's at the root of that is something like, I have to please them all. Guys don't look at this and say, oh, I've got to sexually satisfy all those women. They're there for you, right? So there are all these naturalized elements to this fantasy that are based upon the premise that it's all about the guy. Now let's take this work, another Ang work called The Source. And what we have here is, on the one hand, something that's a fairly common subject. I haven't shown you many of these before, but it's about the idea that one of the things that's quite esteemed about women through the ages is that they're a source of life, right? That women have the magical capacity to give birth, and that's always been highly esteemed. In this case, you've got a classical artist representing that subject as a kind of allegory. And so you're not going to show a woman actually giving birth. That's too vulgar for high art. It's too bodily, frankly. Instead, what you do is you put what appears to be a young woman just kind of verging into adolescence, holding over her shoulder this urn and pouring water out of it. And that urn itself and the water itself is life, right? A woman gives birth in the same way that water is life. And if you go even further on this, the symbolism of that urn goes back to Aristotle's idea that women's contribution to childbirth is like a flower pot into which men plant their seed and the child is grown. In other words, women are the passive recipient of the male active, seed that then they function as an incubator for in order to give birth. And then you look at this more carefully, and probably many of you have noticed in the tradition of the female nude that this woman doesn't even have the anatomy that would make it capable for her to have children. That space where genitalia should be is just a non-space. It's not that she shaves. There weren't depilatory creams out back then or waxing. It's not that. I mean, most of you know, even if you do that, it doesn't look like that, right? What we have going on here is just a total elision of that space. We're just not going to represent it. And the reason for that is that female genitalia was seen as too bodily, too vulgar, too closely associated with sexuality. And, there are a whole host of weirdnesses around the way that Western culture has dealt with female genitalia, and some of you probably are aware of these things. But if you want to see weirdness in action, just look at some of Freud's writing. Go look at the medieval representations of the vagina dentata, which is a vagina with teeth. I mean, it's just all this like fear, like, oh my God, that area, whatever. In any case, it's this fear or anxiety about it that makes it not representatable. You can't represent it. And then you end up, I think, with a really weird problem, which is this work is all about exalting women's capacity to give life, right? To give birth. And yet you can't even represent the mechanism or one of the mechanisms by which birth is attained in this world, because you've got so many hang-ups about the female body. So then you get, and I've set this up on purpose, then you get, of course, Ang, like all of these other artists, of course, one of his bread and butter genres is portraiture. This is how you make a lot of money. These are works that, we tend to shy away from in this class because, you want to go on to more kind of varied subject matter. But if we were to be honest, you would have seen in this class about 80% portraits and maybe 20% other things if we were following along with the production of these artists. So here we have Ang's work called the Comtesse d'Ossanville. And this countess, of course, is set up in a way that would make you think, I suppose, right off the bat, that she is a woman who's doing some thinking, right? She's doing the typical kind of philosopher's pose, hand on her chin, thinking, deep in thought. And you might think right off, okay, great, we finally got a woman thinking. She's about rational mind, intellect, something like that. After all, the woman who sat for this, the countess, was, of course, as a countess, a very well-educated woman, a woman of letters, a woman who wrote, a woman who played music. Maybe we're going to get a woman who's more about appearance. And then you look around and you're like, I'm not sure. After all, he did set her up in front of a mirror so you can see her from the front and back. She's looking fantastic, by the way, and this is a beautiful dress. There's flowers behind her that are symbols of her sexuality or her fertility, right? She's there, available, of marrying age and so forth. Maybe it's not just about the intellect. And then you see this. Right here on the table and right next to it are opera glasses and these little calling cards. And what that tells anyone of this time is that the Comtesse has been off at the opera. And the opera was a place to go not just to witness, the cultural singing of the opera. It was a place that people went in order to be on public display, especially young women who are of marriageable age. There were very few venues that you could go out in public and just be noticed by the public. The opera was one of the favorites of everyone. So you go to the opera, you wear your nicest clothes, you'd flirt with people, you'd sit in your box with mirrors behind you, and everyone would look at you, and then maybe you would garner the attention of viable young suitors. Those calling cards that are on the table are the suitors that are now interested in her, who have left their calling cards. It would be, I don't know what happens in your, I guess it's like swipe left and swipe right or something. She's got a lot of swipes here. In any case, there's a ton, and what she's thinking about is like, is it going to be Jean-Claude or Pierre? I don't know. It's just about which guy will find me more attractive, who is the guy that I'm going to be with. So it's another example. And again, this isn't to beat up on these people. They're products, as we all are, of our age, where women internalize the idea that what matters most is to be desirable, to have someone else desire them. And most of that happens through their physical look, right? How they actually appear, rather than, of course, and this happens more and more as you get older and older, finding people desirable because you have some kind of connection with them and some kind of intellectual or emotional connection to someone else rather than just, damn, they're hot. There are many, many artists of this time period that hover in between kind of Neoclassicism and Orientalism. And this is Jean-Antoine Gros' work called Napoleon in the Pest House at Jaffa. He is one of those who, like Eng, kind of flirts back and forth with these two sides. The story here, and we'll just keep this fairly brief, is this has to do with Napoleon's African campaigns. And as I said before, he went to Africa. He's there to secure the trade routes for the French, to keep the British at bay. He has a tough time of it. Once he lands, the British fleet sneaks in behind him, sinks his entire fleet. So he's basically running across North Africa for the next 2 years, conquering a town only to leave it for the British to take over a few months later. And his army, at a certain stage, contracts the plague. So what they do is they take over, as you see, a mosque space here with these crenellated arches, a horseshoe arch and crenellations at the top over here, to quarantine those people who have the plague. And Napoleon is showing up in this situation with all these people who are dying, healing them. He's reaching out to touch them and supposedly heal them. In other words, it's making an allusion to Jesus Christ again, ministering to the sick, healing people. It's setting up Napoleon as if he is a fearless, kind of Christ-like figure. And to some degree, what is being shown is partially true. Apparently, Napoleon did initially quarantine many of his army. He did show up to offer his support, and then when he had to leave town and he didn't have time to wait for them to get better, he apparently boarded the area up and ordered that they all be shot and burn the bodies. Not the picture you're looking at, though, right? It's about, of course, making him look good. So then, adding another French artist here, but in this case, one work by this artist, Houdon, who worked in France but was commissioned by primarily by Thomas Jefferson, who was at this point in time the minister to France. He was basically a foreign advisor before he became president, and the U.S. Congress, to create a sculpture of George Washington. Thomas Jefferson fully believed, and he's one of the reasons why most of our governmental buildings in Washington, D.C. and then beyond look like classical monuments, that classicism was the embodiment of values that were important to the United States. Democracy, two-party system of Rome, and so forth. And so when he had the chance to have the foremost portrait sculptor sculpt a sculpture of George Washington, he jumped at it. And this man came to the United States. He visited George Washington a couple of times. He even took what's known as a death mask, or some people call it a life mask, of George Washington's face. So if you want to see something that's probably the closest approximation of what George Washington looked like, this is it, although don't bank on it because he did idealize it a little bit. And then he went back to France, and he sculpted this work, and he sent it back to the United States, and Congress got it. And remember what I said about neoclassicism in the United States? They didn't like it. It's too elitist. It's too attached to European values. It's got all this iconography they don't understand. The U.S. Congress said, nope, we don't want this one. And that's why this is in the Virginia State Capitol building now, because they didn't accept the commission, and Thomas Jefferson said, well, then screw you. And, of course, he's going to go on and be governor of Virginia. He took it there instead. Why didn't they like it, though? I mean, on the one hand, it's perfect. It's got everything you expect in the way that you're supposed to represent George Washington. As I said last time, one of the things that made George Washington appealing, and every U.S. politician that I've ever seen tries to, bank on this basic kind of metric, is he was an everyday guy who was completely self-sacrificing, but didn't want power, and was in many ways exemplary or better than most of us as well. You have this weird mix then of a guy who is kind of everyday in a lot of ways, exemplary in other ways, completely self-sacrificing, and doesn't want power. In fact, this is kind of the way that they ended Game of Thrones, right? Oh, how do we do this? I know. George Washington is going to be the winner of the Game of Thrones. That's what they should have done. Would have been a better story. In any case, God, I'm still fuming over that whole series. Anyway, so in any case, part of this has that. He is a gentleman officer. The clothing that he's wearing is mercantile clothing. It's just the kind of clothing that a merchant would wear, with the exception of the epaulette on his shoulders, right? Which associates this with being part of the military. That's a little nod to the idea that we don't have a standing military in the United States at this point. We have citizen soldiers or a militia. In other words, people sacrificed for the betterment of the United States. We don't just pay people to come do it, right? He's more closely aligned with mercantilism than he is with being a soldier. And mercantilism in the United States, of course, was what was going to get us ahead. We are going to be good entrepreneurs, sell our various crops, make a world for ourselves. To make him look everyday too, it was well known that George Washington didn't give a crap about how he looked, or at least not much. He wasn't one of those British dandies who has the wigged hair and all the powder and fancy clothes. In fact, he was known oftentimes for showing up and forgetting to, do a button, or, wearing with his shoes untied or whatever. And that's shown here. It's like button, 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 button. Whoops, missed one, button, button, right? He's actually put that in there. Then you go on from that, and the thing that made him very, very pleasing is that he, of course, after serving 2 terms, was like, I am out. I don't want power. All I want to do is farm. And farming in the United States, and frankly, all over Europe, has always been understood as the noblest of all types of labors. It's a labor that you do where you work with the land itself. You're providing food stuff for people. It's hard work, but it's something that can be lucrative if you do it right. And underneath his coat here is a little badge. You can't see it from our angle, but it's a badge of Cincinnatus. This is a Roman general, Cincinnatus, who gave up his own generalship, his own power, in order to go back to farming. It's part of, again, Gladiator's Russell Crowe characters, a mix between Germanicus and Cincinnatus. And there was an entire order in the United States of Cincinnatus, a whole host of revolutionary soldiers who gave up their commissions to go be farmers. He's got that under there. Then you go on to this. What the hell is that, right? It's rods, or what are known as fasces. Fasces come from ancient Rome. A fasces, or fasces, is basically it's a rod that is an emblem of your ability to be a representative for your constituency. Or another way to put this is, people were elected in Rome to represent, this is Republican Rome before Imperial Rome, to represent a certain body of people. And when you were elected to that office, you were given a fasce. This was a symbol, a kind of scepter, a symbol of your ability to vote for them. And when any big vote was called for in Rome, all the little individual representatives would carry their fasces to Rome and bundle them together as a symbol of, we are individual constituencies, our own areas, but we are also the larger Rome. And together we are incredibly powerful. Now I bet you can guess how many fasces are in this bundle. 13, the 13 original states, right? Perfect. We're the United States. We're based upon the 2-house system of ancient Rome, Republican Rome, right? It makes total sense that we make this reference to it. And then you see behind it a plowshare, the front of a plow. That's what he's giving up all this power for. He just wants to go farm. Hanging up his sword over the edge of this too, right? Giving up that makes total sense. The problem is that the senators and congressmen who received this were like, what the hell is that? And when someone had to explain it to them, they just felt stupid. Like, fasces, we don't know what the hell that is. Why are you making that reference, right? And that's why they said, we don't want it. And as I said before, that one didn't fly, right? Good job, Horatio Greenough. I got an idea. Let's make him a Greek god. And then, again, just to remind you, classicism, too elitist, too esoteric, too much full of this iconography, too European, unless, of course, you give it a really good cover story, like here in Power's Greek Slave. So just a couple more moments of classicism here. If you go back to France and you look at, like, what do classical sculptors, what are they doing at this time? Well, they're doing the same things they've always been doing. Some of them are doing portraits like this. This is a work by Antonio Canova, who's absolutely the most important sculptor at the beginning of the 19th century through about mid-century. He worked partially in Rome, partially in France, and a lot for Napoleon himself. This is Paulina Morghazi, who is Napoleon's sister, but she's being represented as Venus, or victorious Venus, Venus Beatrix as she's known. And what you have is her lying on a divan. She holds in her hand that apple. Again, her body has been idealized. It's actually an idealized version of her face. And of course, she wants to be represented as the most alluring goddess ever to exist. Now, this would have been incredibly controversial if anyone believed that was actually her body, right? It was okay to show the idealized body. You couldn't show nude real people in the world because that, of course, implicates these people's own sexual mores. So this was okay because everyone looked at that and just said, from the neck up, that's Paulina Morghazi. From the neck down, that's just any nondescript idealized Venus. She's just giving herself a personification. I'm sorry, this one always cracks me up. So then you try to apply this to your great leader. And we know how this works, right? The idealized male nude is godlike. You can do it with historical figures pretty well because they don't exist anymore. This is Napoleon as Mars the Peacebringer. So Mars, or Ares as he's known by the Greeks, is the god of war. Kind of standard propaganda for war here, which says that, you know, he's trying to take over the universe, but only to bring peace to the universe here. And he's represented, Napoleon is, as a Greek god. Now, once again, this isn't his body. It's an idealized version of his head. But even though that iconography makes a lot of sense, how many people just find him kind of weird looking? It's like, oh, it's just a dude hanging out up there without his clothes on. He doesn't seem all that authoritarian to me. Right? And that's what Napoleon thought too. He saw this and he said, okay, I get it, right? You put a big staff in my hand, make me the emperor. You put a little kind of emblem of the globe with a Nike figure on top of it. I'm going to take over the universe. Thanks for the fig leaf, by the way. I didn't want anyone to see my stuff. But overall, this doesn't work because I don't see the power here. I just feel like a naked guy standing up in front of everyone. So he banished this to the basement of the Louvre. The most famous of Antonio Canova's works, and a gloriously beautiful work, is this one, Cupid and Psyche. It's carved out with the exception of the wings of a single block of marble. It should look kind of familiar to you. On the one hand, it's got that pyramidal composition, and on the other hand, it extends that composition with the wings in that kind of X form that people like Rubens used a lot in order to add a little bit of dynamic movement to something that's otherwise quite stable. The subject itself is Greek mythology, and it's a pretty good subject. This is Cupid, but Cupid, of course, in Greek times was known as Eros. He's the daughter of Aphrodite. He was a beautiful youth. You know, he wasn't that chubby little, figure flying around indiscriminately shooting people with arrows and so forth. And in this story, what happens is, and again, remember these Greek stories are told multiple different times in multiple different ways, but the standard story is that Psyche is a mortal woman on earth that is so beautiful that everyone is saying she's just as beautiful as Aphrodite. If you know something about the Greek gods and goddesses, they don't like those types of things. They're very, very jealous, very, very envious, and frankly kind of spiteful. So when Aphrodite gets word that there's someone on earth that everyone thinks is just as beautiful as her, she decides that she's going to ruin this woman's life. And the way that she's going to do it is she sends her son Cupid down to shoot this woman with one of his magical arrows that incites lust, but not until Psyche comes into the proximity of some horrible, ugly, atrocious person, right? In other words, she's going to make her fall in love with just like the world's worst guy. So Eros goes down to scope this whole thing out. He just going to see what he's dealing with here. He, let's say, flies down from Mount Olympus, goes into her bedroom late at night, lights a lamp, and looks at her, and he's like, whoa, she is beautiful. She's really beautiful. And he's not really paying attention, and he drips some wax on her, and she wakes up. He blows out the lamp, and she's like, who's in my room with me? And he, again, he's a Greek god, so he's got all the lines. He's like, don't worry, I'm just a Greek god. I don't you're so beautiful, blah, I don't have them. So I can't tell you what he said, guys, but he said something and it worked. She's like, okay. They start this love affair under the condition that, again, he can't let anyone know about this because his mom's going to be pretty damn pissed off, isn't she? And on the other hand, he's a Greek god, and if you see a Greek god, you're turned to ashes, ladies. They're just too gorgeous. And so he says, the only deal is I'll keep coming every night, but you can't turn the lights on. And she's like, at first she's okay with this. She's like, all right, this is wonderful. And then after a couple of weeks, she wants to share her new love affair with other people, and the first people she tells are her sisters. And she says, listen, totally in love with this guy. And they're like, yay, who is he? And she's like, I don't know, some kind of Greek god. He won't let me turn on the lights at night, but it's all cool. And they're like, oh, sister, are you kidding me? Turn on the damn lights. No, he said not to. No, you got to turn on the lights. You don't know what you're dealing with here. And she's like, no, I trust him. No, you got to turn on the lights. And pretty soon, of course, what happens is they go to bed one night. He's fallen asleep. She gets up. She lights that candle. She looks at him. She's like, oh, thank God. He is a Greek god. He's gorgeous. It's Ryan Gosling. Yay. Something like, I don't know. But as she's staring at him and being like, oh my God, this is the best ever. Of course, she loses track of the candle. It drips wax on him. He wakes up and says, what often happens, this monarchy gets into power and they start putting into positions of power around them their friends, people that they owe favors to, people that they want to garner some kind of favor from. All right, your basic nepotism. And one of the people that they put back into power is this old admiral in the Navy. He was an admiral in the Navy of the Revolution, and then in Napoleon, he hadn't sailed for over 20 years, but his family had big connections, he's got big connections, they want to please him, they put him back into power. In other words, they give him a ship. And he immediately apportions that ship with all of his buddies. And after all, they've got a pretty simple job. All they have to do is ferry colonists back and forth between France and Africa. After all, how hard could this be? And just like, I don't know, what is the latest failure of some boat captain? It was for a while Italian cruise ship guys were just running into everything. But this is the way this captain works. He's trying to take those colonists, and he runs into these very well-known series of sandbars. His boat is going down quite slowly. They have enough time to get all the big lifeboats into the water, and their lifeboats, of course, are these big wooden boats, but they don't have enough room for everyone. And so what they do as this ship is going down is that they dismantle part of the ship and they turn it into a raft. And that raft's apparently big enough that they can stick 150 plus people on it. The problem is that the people that they stick on the raft are all the lower class people. All the people of color, all the people that aren't, seated in second or first class, and the captain, his crew, and all the upper class passengers take the lifeboats. And in the first night, they cut that raft adrift. If you've ever tried to tow something behind a rowboat, you can't do it, especially a makeshift raft with 150 plus people on it. And when they are rescued, which happens in a day, of course, they don't want to tell anyone what happened. It'd all be better if those people just perish at sea and they don't have to admit to the fact that, again, following the French Revolution, where the watchwords were liberty, fraternity, and equality for all, they have just killed off 150 plus lower class passengers and saved themselves. So they just vacillate. We don't know what happened. We don't know where it went. We were towing them and then something happened. that boat, that raft, drifts out at sea for about 15 days. And this is where I think, why haven't they turned this into a feature movie? Over that 15 days, people are staying alive any way they can stay alive. And they share these stories when they're finally rescued. For 15 days, they do things like drink each other's urine. As soon as someone dies, they'll start eating someone's body just to stay alive. Anything to stay alive. And after that 15 days, only about 15 of them are still alive. And within 5 days after that, about 5 more die of exposure. So only about 10 survive out of 150 plus. And this becomes huge news. But it's huge news in a country where the press is primarily controlled by the state. And so they minimize it. They try to tell a story in a way that looks favorable to the newly restored monarchy who put this guy in power. But enough people know what happened that they want to do something to change it. And that's what Jericho does. In this work, what he shows you is that raft. And by the way, Romantic works are huge. This thing's 20 plus feet across versus classical works that tend to be moderate in size. And he starts us off, as a Romantic will, by looking at dead bodies in the foreground, spilling out into our space, that old Baroque device of making you feel like you're there. He has the living symbolically supported by the dead. Now, he doesn't want to show anything as vulgar as someone gnawing on another person's arm, but he symbolically shows it in that those that are still alive are literally living off the bodies of the dead. In other words, they're supported in this crescendo that moves you up this axis, AXIS, so one central axis running this way, up to this man at the top of the apex of this triangle, trying to flag down this tiny little boat off in the background. That is oftentimes referred to by art historians as the axis of hope. Right? Everything in this long crescendo along this axis up to the man at the top, who is, by the way, a man of color. When we know who he is, he's one of the few survivors. His name was Jean Charles. Man of color, equality, liberty, fraternity for all. Man of color at the top of this apex. Doing everything he can, despite all, possibilities of being saved, to flag down that boat. The living supported by the dead. And notice how he sets this up. It's on a long diagonal. Lots of movement, lots of dynamism. He takes us through light, dark, little staccatos of these very strong contrasts that are also going to add more energy to the work of art. To create this kind of frantic, we've got to be saved feeling. And then the other axis, a little bit less prominent, but go up through this dead body that spills out in your space, up through this hip, up the mast, and that sail that's dragging you into this giant wave. That's the axis of despair. Right? On the one hand, you're longing to be saved. On the other hand, you're constantly threatened with the possibility of being capsized, destroyed, die. That's how these people are caught between these two things. The entire composition, by the way, is one diagonal after another. Everything in this about movement. Even the horizon line's not quite stable, as if you're on a raft moving around. In order to come up with this imagery, he wanted to feel what it was like to be in this situation. Now, he couldn't see it. He interviewed people, and what he did was, and this is so romantic, by the standards of Romantic painting, he had the morgue delivered to him on a weekly basis, bodies and body parts, so that he could live with them in his studio to feel death around him. I know, let's go the extra mile, right? This isn't a classical artist who's like, I'll just think my way through it. He wants to feel it. What is death like? What would it feel like to have to eat that, to be surrounded by that day after day, to think I could die at any moment? That will spark my imagination and generate my creative, original response to this picture. Now, after he did this, he's like, well, where's he going to show it? Damn sure not going to show it in the French royal salon, right? They're not going to accept this. They're going to be like, nope. So what he did is pretty brilliant in my mind. He's like, who doesn't like the French? I know. The British don't like the French. Never have, right? I will send it on tour in England. In the end, he ended up sending it to Ireland. Perfect there, too. It's like, who doesn't even like the British? The Irish, I know, perfect. So, in any case, sends it through Ireland, gets over 40,000 visitors. It's the most visited work of art of its age. Nothing even close to it. So we'll finish up with Jericho, but just quick little point to make. Jericho, with a lot of other Romantic artists, got very curious about what later will become known as human psychology, right? The human mind. And one of the things that is at work in this work called The Madman is that he was hired by an early psychologist, but the man's name was Dr. Georget, who had a plan. Remember, at this time, they really do believe that someone's outer appearance is an indicator of your interior state. And before this, they always thought, oh, it's the state of your soul. But now they're thinking, no, all of these types of problems that people have psychologically might be something you can see on their face, in the way that they look, on their facial expressions, whatever it might be. And even though they have photography out right now, they believe, and I think they're absolutely right, that artists are more perceptive of those little minute differences in the human face. And so a number of artists start creating portraits of people that were understood to be clinically insane. And he did a bunch of these. So here's like his Madman. He's trying to, again, get to what are the characteristics of this particular kind of ailment, believing that if you created enough of these portraits, you would eventually have a kind of index for various mental ailments, or the mad woman here. Okay, easy by comparison to what you've done so far, right? So good work on that. Again, it's just one of those tough classes. I don't think the university's quite figured out how to kind of mix it all together. You end up doing almost double duty by doing writing along with having to deal with the content of the course. So good work. We're in the midst of talking about Romanticism, and we're still in France here. We're going to be looking fairly briefly, survey course-wise, at Eugene Delacroix's work. And Delacroix is one of those names that a lot of people know about because he had a very long career. He was the major spokesperson for Romanticism, meaning he was the one who was agitating for change within the French Royal Academy to, again, this is the first really competitive style to Neoclassicism within the French Academy. You have that little blip of a moment in the Rococo, but really this is something that pushes itself as a new modern movement with whole hosts of different aesthetic criteria by which artists to be judged, and he's the person who is the major spokesperson and exemplar for this movement. So he's an important guy. Théodore Géricault, who we've already looked at, would have been probably just as important, but he died so young that he wasn't around long enough to make more than the kind of impact that his work could make in that little brief period of time. In any case, let's go over again some of the things. I'm going to try to do this as we work our way to the end of the quarter that maybe weren't your perfect moment in your midterm. Maybe it was. Maybe this doesn't apply to you, but I really want to emphasize the things that can always turn up in your essays so that you know all of the details to put in there. Something about the context, obviously. So what's going on at the time? You think about Théodore Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa, and you think the political context. That's the key context. A newly restored monarchy, all the problems that are occurring with that, why you want to agitate for that change. In general, for Romanticism, you have to think of that political context over and over again because, remember, one of the key components of Romanticism is it is contesting the status quo. And this is a big modernist addition to art. Before this time period, you rarely get art because it is, after all, primarily patronized by the ruling or authoritarian classes contesting the status quo of affairs in the world. They want everything to remain the same. It tends to be very conservative, especially classical works of art that are all about conservatism. So we have that shift, and that's going to be in the background of all of this. we have the rise of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is something you kind of already know about. It's the flowering of humanism, Renaissance humanistic ideas about perfecting ourselves, about amassing knowledge, about learning about everything that we can so as to better ourselves and have a better grasp of the world. And frankly, they're all still fairly religious, God's place or what he wants from us in this world. That reaches its apogee in the 19th century. This is the period in which what we call the Enlightenment, all these things that we've inherited, scientific investigation, right? Trying to amass an encyclopedic knowledge of all things, really pushing the idea that there is one kind of perspective or truth onto various questions and trying to determine what that truth is. Those are the product of this time period, from the late 18th through the 19th century. And of course, these things change after our class is over. We live now in an age of intense skepticism about truth with a capital T or anything being enduring and timeless, but that's a whole different art history class. So another thing that you always want to keep your eye on is, and this can be integrated into your essays, is what is the nature of the style? What are its constituent parts? How can I find these in the works of art? So with Romanticism, one is, as we just said, contesting the status quo of affairs. They want to be critical, particularly people or positions of authority in their world, or even artistic criteria that is taken for granted. They want to kind of poke at those things and criticize them. Number two, Romanticism is interested in what they called at the time the irrational or the super-rational. Things that are beyond just rational investigation, such as emotions, such as the concept of the sublime that we looked into, right? Something that is subtle, that is nuanced, that is psychological, rather than just the rational mind. Number three, the watchword for Romanticism is creativity and originality fueled by the imagination. These fairly stereotypical views about what artistry really is, they are a product of this age, of the late 18th, 19th century. Before that, remember, artists could be creative, they could have some degree of originality, but they're basically embroidering around the edges of things that have already been done before, over and over and over. It's not up to them to revolutionize a style or come up with something entirely new. That's not even on their minds. So these ideas about artists being creative and original, and those of you who are young artists and your teachers say something like, well, that's been done before, that's a product of Romanticism. So imagination, this faculty of the human mind that can compose freely in a manner that previously would have been thought of as the way that God composes, creates, from the void, out of nothing. Yeah. Another thing that's in there somewhere is they like to activate the role of the viewer again. They are absolutely interested in getting you to be a participant in constructing the scene before you. And I'll give you an example in this work here. So this is Eugene Delacroix's work called Massacre at Chios. And the subject is something you've actually seen before, although you saw it in a neoclassical version. This is the Greek Wars of Independence against the Ottoman Turks. And remember how horrible these things are and some of the horrible things that are happening as the Turks are leaving Greece. Major tragedies. Well, this is one of the biggest of them, or rather perhaps I should put it, this is one of the most reported upon. Chios is one of those islands in Greece, and it happens to be the birthplace of Homer. So Homer of the Iliad and the Odyssey, that old original kind of Western author of the epic poem, considered to be the beginning of Western literature at this time, right? So the birthplace of of Western literature, in a way, is being destroyed by these heathen Ottoman Turks. And it becomes something that gets reported on quite a bit. Delacroix says, hey, talking about these things in words can only get you so far. I'm going to do it in a painting, and I'm going to do it in a painting that is going to make you feel the scene, make you want to change this, make you impacted, engage you. Remember, they don't have photography yet, or photography is just starting to come around, so the whole idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words, that originally applied to painting. And he's thinking, if I paint this picture, people will actually feel it. As a matter of fact, that quote that I gave you on the bottom of your lecture guide puts it this way. The type of emotion peculiar to painting is, so to speak, tangible. Poetry and music cannot give it. You enjoy the actual representation of objects before you as if you really saw them, and at the same time, the meaning which the images have for the mind warms you and transports you. What is he getting at? It makes you feel like you're there. It's more real. It's more tangible. It's the way that people talk today about various technologies that create a kind of hyper reality for you, right? In this time, this is what he's up to. So let's talk about the technique, which you can't see, by the way, without seeing this picture in person. The way that this is painted is in that very painterly mode. And write this down because it's not something you can really confirm by looking at an image of this. That means it's loose brush strokes. He doesn't try to finish anything up. If you were to look at the surface of this painting, you would see all those individual brush strokes. And remember where before, when we were talking about things like going back to Titian, I said painterly, or colorist, as they sometimes called it, paint application was understood to appeal to the emotions, whereas linearity, sharp contour lines, appeals to the mind. That's just an artistic convention, but they're drawing upon that and they're pushing it one step further. Delacroix is saying, in completing, putting together all of these brushstrokes into the object, I am activating you as a viewer. You're becoming a participant in actually constructing the image in front of you. And that will make it more likely that you'll be impacted by the scene that I'm showing you. Now, a good way to go at this is, I think, and here's a close-up of that. You still can't see it very well. Is to do something that, we started with early on in the quarter, and it's just a good way to bring into high relief some of the differences and the peculiarities of each work. So I'm going to turn this over to you. On the right is Hiram Powers' Greek Slave. It's on the exact same subject, right? But it's a classical interpretation of this subject. And on the left, Delacroix's, again, Massacre at Chios, same subject, but a romantic version of that subject. What's different about these two works, and what do those differences mean? Turn to your neighbors and share your thoughts. So what stands out in particular about this work? What is he seeming to want to emphasize, and how is he emphasizing it? How is it different than the classical work? Yeah.
Well, this one is in no way sexual whatsoever. It's just meant to like portray more fear and horror.
Okay, so she says in no way sexual, meant to portray fear. Let's put it, if you don't mind, tell me if I get this wrong. It's not erotic in the same way. It doesn't allow you as the viewer to feel like, well, that woman could be there for me, or maybe I'm here to save her, or there's something that's, it doesn't implicate the other work, the classical work, doesn't implicate anything in terms of any fear or anxiety or any downside to someone being taken as a sexual slave. This one does have that indication over there, right? This figure being dragged away by the very romanticized Turk, very exoticized. That's the implication. She's going to be taken into sexual slavery, which in this picture doesn't look like such a good thing, right? It doesn't look as easy as the other work made it look. What else? Way back.
Where the sculpture was kind of like an abstract representation of everything. This serves more like you were talking about as like a photo, basically.
Okay, good. So remember what I said about this. I said, well, one of the things that's going on here is he's probably not really referring, or at least his emphasis isn't in the Greek slave, on real women being taken into real slavery. He's talking about the enslavement of Greek values, which again is on a lot of people's minds, right? Greek, the seat of Western culture, of democracy, all these good things. And so he sculpts that woman to look like a classical Greek sculpture, to say, the enslavement of Greek things, rather than real women are actually bearing the burden of this, these atrocities. Whereas Delacroix goes at it from the standpoint of, no, real women really are, real people really are being affected. This isn't just about the idea of Western culture being threatened by Muslim Ottoman Turks. Yes, those types of very, very prejudiced values go way back. So you're supposed to feel that. Yes?
On Hero Powers, the Greek slave, she's not really upset by anything. Right?
Not at all.
She's like, oh, dang it.
Yeah.
But on the left, it's like there's definitely emotionality going on, and there's some movement too that is like makes you feel something.
Okay, so let's put both of these out there. This looks like a woman who's being dragged backwards. That doesn't look like a comfortable position. She looks complacent over here. The emotionality of this, can you tell what that is? That is a dead woman. She's been killed somehow. Her child doesn't recognize this yet, so her child is climbing up onto her chest to nurse, not knowing that mom's already dead. Is that anything you've seen, anything close to that in a classical work of art? And can you imagine what people would have thought at this time when they see this kind of stuff for the first time? I mean, they would have thought of it as intensely vulgar. You don't show that. That's too horrible. It's too emotional. And he's like, yeah, that should be. These are horrible things happening. If we're going to deal with contemporary events, we can't turn them into some kind of personification of Greek values. Real stuff is happening to real people. This should be something that art should take into account. And you're right. Look at the composition itself. Now, this isn't your standard pyramidal form, but it is basically horizontal, vertical. Everything is very little movement there, your standard contrapposto. And over here, everything is diagonal one way or another, right? With one little void in the middle so you can look off into the distance, but really up close, death, malaise, people being drawn off into sexual slavery, all in your face, pushed up into the picture plane in dynamic composition. All of this is supposed to activate you. All of this is supposed to make you say, this is BS, let's go change this. How do we stop this? Rather than, that's too bad. Give me 4 more of those. Those are hot, right? And this was a big thing that he was up to, and it's one of the reasons that these works are what we call modern. Now, modernism, you'll know, if you take art history, you take history classes, sometimes they'll date it all the way back to the late medieval period. Here's the beginning of modernism. Lately, Renaissance historians are like, this is the beginning of the modern period, because they're actually looking at history and trying to, bring forth with very great degrees of consciousness new modern or revolutionary ideas. Generally speaking, though, historians place modernism at the end of the 18th through the 19th century, or at least this is an intensification of what we call the modernist period. And one key component of modernism is that it looks back at earlier moments and redoes them, kind of revitalizes them, thinks through them in a different way. In art, that means looking back at earlier genres or subjects and saying, wait a minute, how did the classicists, and this is particularly the case with Romantic artists, how did the classicists do this subject, and why did they get it wrong? What's a better, more interesting way to do it? So you think of something like this. This is called The Women of Algiers. And we've already seen, again, Ingres do the Grand Olisk. And I could have shown you a million more versions of the Orientalist painting style that glamorizes and exoticizes basically sex slavery. And here's Delacroix, and he makes his trip to northern Africa. And he supposedly, although I think it's worth questioning whether this actually happened, visited a harem. And he came back armed with ideas about what this was really like and wanted to show people the reality rather than the exoticized, fantasized version of this. Right? So how is this different than Ingres' Grand Odelisk? Well, number one, they actually look like they might be from North Africa. Right? These aren't, remember the starting point for Ingres' work, the reason that was acceptable in the French Royal Academy was it starts with that kind of cultural superiority statement, implicit but still there, that we don't treat our women this way. And then you put a very westernized looking harem slave in the scene. And you put them in there over and over and over again. Now we've got, they look like they could be from Algeria, for sure. Their ethnic type looks possible there. Then we go to another stage and we say, well, what do women actually do in harems if we could know that? Well, apparently they don't sit around nude all day, braiding each other's hair and playing music, right? Apparently maybe they sit around without, with clothes on, bored to tears, waiting for something else to happen, smoking their hookah, chatting, whatever it is, but it doesn't have the same fantasy, does it? It looks kind of like every day. Now, it's set in another realm, but it doesn't have that extreme, hey, here's a male fantasy for you. And when he goes out, I mainly brought this in, this is his Odelisk, right? So think of these two together. I mainly bring this in to say he did a whole bunch of these. You can see the difference in the painterly style. This is colorist, or that loose brushstroke that's supposed to involve you. But I want to get at a bigger question. And you don't need to know anything about the history of art for this. I just want you to look at these two representations of women, and I want you to tell me what stands out for you. When I put them next to each other, what stands out for you? Turn to your neighbors and share your thoughts. What do you think? I mean, I hear you all saying very similar things. So how do we put a fine point on this? What does that one on the right look like? That looks like, to me, the Hollywood version of what sex slavery would be, right? Like, oh, let's see, how do we make this pretty, make it look good, make it a fantasy, make there be no downside. And for what it is, again, I'm being critical of these things because, frankly, after doing this for 25 years, they just kind of bore me. I mean, I look at them, I'm like, that's a really well-painted work. It's wonderful. It's got all these problems with it when it comes to misogyny and so forth, but so does everything else in the history. I'm just kind of, whatever. This one stands out because it's new. It's a new way of representing it. And what does it look like to you? How does it feel to you is a better way to put it. How about if I put it this way? Guys, walking into the room, which one works better for you? I meant heterosexual guys. Right? Is that one kind of scary? Is that one a little bit like, I don't know what's going on here? That looks maybe a little dirty, a little, I don't know. Like there's more risk involved off to the left. That you're not sure who she is or what this is all about. That it brings up all of those questions. And that's what he wants to do. I mean, on the one hand, he's not getting away from exoticism and eroticism. It's still there. It's just kind of like down and dirty, and that's all the messiness of this situation versus cleaned up, perfect, scenario set up by Hollywood. You can also see the way that's painted. That's supposed to involve you. That's supposed to spark your emotions. It's supposed to be kind of sultry and sexy and a little bit scary, and all of those things are supposed to be working on you. You're supposed to have those feelings rather than, yay! You should also know, and I like to bring this up because I teach the history of photography here at the University of Washington, along with theories of photography, that it's right about this moment that photography starts to be used by artists. And when they first use it, what they're basically using it for is to save themselves the difficulty of having to have a live model pose for them incessantly. They'll oftentimes take a photograph, use that photograph in order to work up images, and then sometimes have that model come back and sit for a final sitting to get any kind of nuanced details that they want. It also, though, lets me tell you that even things that are supposed to look realistic, and Delacroix went out of his way to say, I saw this firsthand, are staged. Algeria in particular and all parts of Africa have been colonized by the West at least since, the 1500s. And these people were, of course, immigrating to France at the time. Still a lot of problem with the types of things that go on, frankly, in France around these former colonized nations having to immigrate there. But they're all around. And so he's basically hiring models on the streets of Paris to sit for him and then turning them into exotic fantasies about Odelisk. Because, again, he's cashing in on that exotic Orientalist picture. Just very briefly, this is one of his most famous of these kind of Orientalizing pictures. It is called The Death of Sardanapalus. And it's actually based upon a Lord Byron poem about Sardanapalus, who was an Assyrian general who, when faced with his own demise, decides that he's going to go up in a blaze of glory with all of his most prized possessions. He's going to take them all with him. And that's what you're witnessing here, right? He's not going to win, so he gathers around him everything that he prizes, his favorite concubines, his horses, all of his wealth. Kills off those concubines in front of you, right? They are treated as if they are the same as the horse or any other wealth. And he just sits up there and assesses this power above him, right? Just standard kind of eroticized pictures of this time period of ultimate authority, ultimate power placed in the hands of some, again, supposedly bad male of the past. But the question always occurs to me, and this happens all the time, and I just find it interesting from a standpoint of being human. why are we so drawn to, bad characters? Not only in history, but in our own kind of make-believe realms of literature and movies and so forth. And we know what we mean, right? How many people have watched shows on like serial murderers and just been kind of fascinated about this stuff? Or, films on Hitler or whatever, just the worst things that you can imagine occurring, we're drawn to for various reasons. I'm not saying we're like embracing it, but there's some part of us that is drawn to these things, and I wonder what it is. And I just wanted you to know, of course, this happens in painting as well, in sculptures as well. It's not just a product of your own age, but it's something to be curious about, I think. Like, why do we get drawn to these figures? And I don't like the easy answers that say, well, because they're so unusual. You just want to figure out the quirks of their mind. I don't think it's that easy. I think it's a heck of a lot more complicated. This is the big one. This is the one that you should definitely have your finger on when it comes to final time, right? The way that this works, it's no secret the way that I set up all of my questions. I want representative examples of big ideas that we've covered over the last half of the quarter. And within every style, there's probably 3 or 4 possibilities that seem to stand out. And this is one of them, right? So far, we've looked at the Raft of the Medusa. That's one. Within Romanticism, this is another one. This is called Liberty Leading the People. And I'm sure everyone's seen this before. It's been reproduced a cajillion times. So now you need to know something about the context. What this refers to is not the original French Revolution. It refers to what was known as the July Revolution that took place in July of 1830. And this was the revolution that took out that leader who had been put into place after Napoleon, who led to the big catastrophe of the Raft of the Medusa, as well as many other things. They got rid of him, and they, believe it or not, they did the exact same thing. They reinstalled another monarch, Louis Philippe, checked his power by parliamentary system, but this is the revolution that led to that. Now, there's some very typical things of Romanticism in this work, and then there are a whole host of things that you need to know something more about, but I bet you all of you can get some distance in interpreting this work of art. So what I'd like you to do is, first of all, I'd like you to think, who am I looking at? Right? Who are these characters? What is the woman in the middle? Why does she apparently have a wardrobe malfunction? Who are the people flanking her? What do they represent? What's in that muddled background? What do they represent? Where is this set? How could I tell where this is set? That's number one. Number two, I want you to go and think, if Kolya asked me very specifically on the final, how is this work an excellent example of Romanticism, what would I answer? Turn to your neighbors and share your thoughts on those questions. All right, so let's start off with this curiosity. So here's the thing. Women did participate in the fighting in both the French Revolution and the many revolutions that happened in the late 18th through the 19th century in France, right alongside the men. Right? They fought right alongside the men. However, representing a woman fighting right alongside the men was something that most artists would say, I don't want to do that. And the reason that they don't want to do that is twofold. One is that women are supposed to be, by their very nature, not violent. And artists have always been beholden to the idea that what you're supposed to be representing is the ideal form, not necessarily the reality. Number two, it is a huge deal for an artist to do something like represent a woman fighting along men, even if it were the reality, because they will then be associated with women's right movements. And many of them don't want that. I mean, even the most, let's say, liberal, forward-thinking, feminist-oriented artist has to think twice about, well, if I do this, I'm going to be the artist who is associated with women's right to vote, women being allowed the right to own property, women being able to divorce their husbands, all of these other things. That's who I will be, and most of them say, I just don't want that heat. I'm not going to do it. So when Delacroix decides to put a woman in here, it's almost like he vacillates between saying, I want to acknowledge that women were in this fight. I'm going to make her look like a typical French woman wearing typical French clothing. But then I've got to turn her into a personification or a symbol too. And the way that I do that is I bare her breasts. If you remember all those sculptures you've probably seen before of women as justice, women as liberty, women as truth, they all are bare from the waist up. It's a way to turn a woman into a personification. Feminists often call this women as bearers of meaning, not makers of meaning. I also heard a few of you say, well, it sexualizes the image. And I'm not going to say that that's not a part of it too. That, yeah, the simple argument that men like breasts, men are painting these pictures, they include a lot of breasts in them, sure, that's in there, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is to say, I don't want you to think that I am completely behind the idea that it's okay to represent women in this fighting. And so I'm going to turn her into a personification by giving her this wardrobe malfunction. I'll also turn her into a personification too, though, by putting that little cap on her head. That cap is what's called a Phrygian cap. I don't care if you remember Phrygian, who the hell would. It's Phrygian, if you care. And it's the types of caps that were given to freed slaves in ancient Greece, so it's a symbol of liberty. And they're being liberated, of course, from the autocracy of this failed, restored monarchy. And then off to her left, who is that? Her left, our right. Yep. Child. What kind of child? Remember the age that we're in. This is Victor Hugo age. Right? Les Mis. Who are we thinking of? Orphans. Orphans in all, Charles Dickens' tales and so forth. And what does an orphan represent? The failure of society to take care of the innocent. The failure of society to take care of the youth. And this guy's going to take care of himself. Right? He wears on his side a messenger bag. That's standard for this age. And he is taking up arms to liberate himself, to lead to a better tomorrow. Off to the other side, you can probably tell this, people dressed in this type of lower clothing associated with the lower classes, the working classes. And remember, it's the working classes who these revolutions are primarily for. And whenever you see in the 19th century someone wearing a top hat, think bourgeoisie, think middle class. And by middle class, we mean people like most of us, I think, but maybe a little bit higher in class. They're people that tend to own their own businesses and don't have to worry so much about income, right? Things are fairly well set for them. And they're all fighting for the cause. They're all identified as types in the foreground by individualizing them, and then in the background you see more of those types. You can barely make them out, just to give you the idea of a big mass of fighting of these types of people. Then right in the foreground, a couple of really important things. This person with the epaulette, where you also see this cap back here, that's basically the royal army. So they're associated with the people who are being overthrown. And right off the bat, they're right in the foreground, death. That's how you enter this scene, right? Very romantic, lots of diagonals, lots of death and emotional things going on. This guy has pretty much all of his clothing on. This guy over here is a working class person. His clothing, at least part of it, has been taken away. He doesn't have any pants on, shoes are missing, and so forth. And the question is why, right? What's the explanation for this? And one of the answers is revolutionaries need those things. If their fallen comrades, don't need them anymore, they will reuse them, but they're not going to take any of the military garb that is associated with the royalty itself. The other explanation, though, on artistic grounds is equally compelling, and probably both of these are at work. Delacroix wants to show you, because it's so important for artists at this time, that he understands how to render good anatomy. He's still competing with the classicists. He wants to show you he can do that anatomical detail just like a classicist could. Same way that you saw it in Jericho's work with nude bodies all over the place. They want to show you, this major subject in art. They can do it too. Finally, off in the corner, and this is a little bit sad to me, that's Notre Dame. Those are its two twin towers up there. And all the smoke around it now, right? And that sets the scene, but that's important. Notre Dame is on a little island in the middle of the Seine in Paris, between the right and left banks, called the Ile de la Cité. And the Ile de la Cité is the oldest part of Paris. It goes back to the original founding of Paris as, the monarchical center of France. That is the seat of authority. That is the seat of power. That's what needs to be upset here. The seat of Paris, the Ile de la Cité, is the seat of the Ancien Regime, which is, of course, what the Romantics claim the classicists are all about supporting. Does anyone have any questions?